You're very welcome to July's webinar as part of Aware's series. And we're just going to wait a few moments for as many people as possible to get in, and then we'll start. Just check how many people are in. Oh, it's fantastic. So I think we'll start. My name is Claire Hayes, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this month's webinar, Brain Imaging and Mood, the Role of the Brain in Mental Health. For those of you who are familiar with Aware, you don't need any introduction. But for those of you who are new, Aware is an organization that provides support to people who are experiencing depression or bipolar disorder, and to families who are concerned about people who might be struggling. We have a range of services, and I encourage you to have a look at the website. I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Dara Cannon. She's a neuroscientist, a researcher, and a lecturer at NUI Galway. And Dara, thank you so much for participating in the webinar today. And my very first question is, what is a neuroscientist? So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and maybe answer that question in the process, please.
Sure. So I am a scientist, and I suppose during studying I would have found just everything to do with the brain and the mind absolutely fascinating. And so you can take a general science degree, but then tend to specialize. So ultimately then, if you're tracking through research on the mind or the brain, then you would be called a neuroscientist. And they come in all forms. They can be pharmacologists, so then they're neuropharmacologists, or physiologists and the neurophysiologists. So there can be a lot of different types. And I would be a combination of a neuroanatomist and then a neurobiochemistry as well, and some pharmacology. But essentially, you're a scientist who's really fascinated by the brain, and you're doing work on those questions that are relevant to the brain. Yeah.
And I know from the conversations we've had leading up to this webinar, you absolutely are fascinated by the brain, as I am, but I just don't understand it at all. And I think you...
Or do I there?
I think you have a much better sense. So this is really a conversation between the two of us, and I'm representing everybody else who's listening. And we've had a few questions in beforehand, and we might get some questions in between. And Jamie and Karen, who are working with us on this webinar, are going to moderate the questions, are going to feed them to me. So every so often you'll see me putting my glasses on, looking down. It's not I'm bored, it's that I'm just catching what next question is. So Dara, in terms of setting a context for this, is there any, like, how would you describe yourself or your interest and your fascination, and what way do you want this conversation to go today?
Well, I suppose I'm really happy to take any questions anyone has. It's important from the outset to say that I'm not a clinical psychologist and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't have a medical degree. And what I'm fascinated about is the biology underlying mood and anxiety disorders and depression, and to understand them to the extent where we could influence medical practice and try to change how we understand them, but also how we might manage them. And I was naive enough starting out to think we'll solve this. This will be solved, you know, and a couple of decades later, you know, I'm wondering, well, when will we begin to solve it? And when I say solve, I suppose I mean change the way that we could actually treat them with some biological evidence. And in some ways, that's why psychiatry is sometimes called the last frontier of medicine, because biology isn't as strongly used in deciding exactly what to do when someone is suffering or has depression or anxiety. Relative to other disorders, if you have an issue with the liver, for example. So when we think about brain scans and blood tests or genetic tests, they're not core in their use or not used at all in the diagnosis or decisions about treatment within psychiatric disorders. And I think that's an awful shame. That's what I'd love to see, that boundary pushed a little bit from some of the biological evidence that exists now. And yeah, I think from even before maybe could ever have been called a scientist, anything to do with the mind would have absolutely fascinated me, observing a delusion and recognizing that this is a highly intelligent, high functioning person, and how on earth could their mind let them down in this way? What is a delusion? How could this happen? And so, core root fascination with what happens when the thought processes or our decision making goes awry. But then I'd be very technically minded. So I think, there's a solution, there's an explanation, and I still believe there absolutely is. And so we chase that incessantly. And for the most part, I use brain imaging or brain scans to try to do that.
Well, I have lots of questions already, but I know you have prepared a whole wonderful feast for us to learn about. So if you want to kick off, and then when I know you've some slides you want to start with, and then I'll come back with some questions.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm happy to take any questions to lead this in any particular direction. If anybody listening, kind of is interested in some particular parts. But I suppose I'll start by showing you an image of a neuron. I thought that might be a nice place.
Now, this is where I'm going to kick in, because remember I was saying to you that I'm going to just ask you to loads of questions that if I think anyone might not understand. So can you explain what a neuron is, please?
I will. I'm going to bring one up.
You're so used to all of this, and for those of us who aren't, the words like that might be just a bit technical.
Sure. So just let me know if you can see the neuron in one second.
No. Oh yeah, it's coming in now.
Great.
Green broadcast. Oh, there's a cup of tea.
There we go. Yes, that was tea Amy made for me.
Right.
So there's a neuron. So it's the unit cell that is used in communicating. And so if we see an apple on a table, you have impulses that are reaching your cortex in the brain, and the neurons are the cells that are lifting up that little electrical signal and sending it around the brain to be processed, so that you can not just see the apple, but recognize it's an apple, perhaps even smell it as well. And that goes into the pot as you realize, oh, it's definitely an apple because I can smell it, I can see it, and I've seen one of these before. And all of that happens even in less than a second. You're not even aware that you're doing all that work to recognize this apple. And these cells are the unit that helps bring that little bit of electricity from one neuron to the next neuron as it bounces through different areas. Some areas have some certain functions, some will just help you see it, some will process that you smelled it. And so you can have quite a lot of jumping between different regions in the process of recognizing that apple. So you can see different parts here. You can see the dendrites. I'm just going to draw your attention to the dendrites because I have really a video that I'm excited to share with you. And the dendrites, they look like little branches off what I tend to call, for whatever reason, the top of the neuron, but that's the incoming part. So signals come in through those dendrites, and then they go down that myelin or axon all the way to the end, the terminals, and then they pass to the dendrites of the next neuron. And I think what we forget sometimes is that what the dendrites are doing all the time is they're actually trying to find connections. And this is fundamental because as we interact in our environment, or we have feelings, or we think, it's the branching and connections that these make that are flexible and that adapt to our environment. So I'm going to show you this. This is it's quite short. I'll show you twice. First, just have a look and see. You can see 4 lines. Those are the axons. And those little branches that look a bit thinner that are coming off it, when I play it the next time, we'll watch them a bit more closely. This is sort of a snapshot every 2 minutes for 3 hours, just watching these 4 neurons and those 4 axons. And this time when I play it, just have a look at those branches, and they're searching. Can you see that look at the top one and its connections with the second one. They're really searching and trying to find each other. And it's very powerful. The most, I suppose, studied example would be learning. And as you learn, you make connections. As you revise, you strengthen those connections, and they never really leave.
Dara, sorry, have you just shown us a photograph, an image of somebody's thinking process, of an action, of somebody's brain? Is that what we're seeing?
These are cells inside Drosophila, and so we can't get to this level in a, I'll just stop broadcasting there, but
All right.
we can't get to that level, say, in vivo in a person yet. We're close. We can see groups of neurons activating using an MRI scanner, doing functional MRI. And so rather than neuron by neuron in vivo in the human right now, we just don't have quite that same resolution. But we can certainly see it, and we know that it's involved in any kind of motor processing, decision making. And so we're quite confident that it occurs in the human as well. Even though we can't visualize it, we have a lot of other types of biological data to prove that that's occurring, yeah.
Okay, so that image that you just showed us, what's that from then?
It's from a small fly, essentially, brain, and there was 4 neurons, the larger line, and you can see them searching. But I suppose that I find those videos remarkable because they stop you thinking about the brain as a static thing.
Yes.
You know, we don't often think about organs as doing something, but the brain is the busiest one in there. It's really busy. It's pulsating as the blood goes up and down. It's not a fixed, still thing. And we can easily forget that it's doing all this processing for us in our decision making, and that it both can be influenced by your environment, be that socially in a conversation, or that you got a bad night's sleep, or, you know, all of these different things, they influence those activations and how they work, in addition to it influencing our behavior. And one of the most exciting things, I think, in human brain imaging at the minute is that we're working really hard to get the behavior and the brain related to each other. So the design of the brain studies is specifically to see how do we predict and map an image in relation to human behavior. And it's so complex, human behavior, that it's really eluded quite a number of decades worth of neuroscientists in terms of being able to, but the technology is beginning to catch up to where philosophy is in terms of relating behavior to the brain.
My understanding of depression is always a biopsychosocial model. So bio, the biological, psycho, the psychological aspects and what we're thinking, and then social in terms of whether we isolate ourselves or whether we're out there. And also as part of that, obviously, is people's dependency on things to make them feel better. And some of those work and some of them backfire, like alcohol, for instance. So I've always been fascinated by the brain, but not really understood it. So as you were talking there, I was wondering, I don't think we've got to the point yet, but if somebody is reading something in a book, and then they read something that's very sad, talking about the death of somebody, and that reminds them of a difficult experience or a sad experience in their own life, and then they feel sad. Are you talking about then that we can actually, that scientists will be able to map that and see as they're reading, so their behavior, and then they read something sad, that they have a different response, and that we can see that? Or am I being too simplistic about that?
No, definitely. So if autobiographical memory, if you told me about something that happened to you, I document it and I read it back to you while you're in the fMRI scanner, you will see a distinct set of regions activate depending on whether that memory precipitates feelings of guilt versus sadness versus happiness. So that would have been one of the, Marcus Rakel described that using a PET scanner a few decades ago, and that would have been the first one of the first moments where we understood that different networks of brain regions are involved in different emotions as we experience them. So we can dynamically scan over time while someone's doing that. You can't move in that particular scanner that we currently use, but there's beginnings of designing mobile fMRI, which might allow us to do slightly more real life scenario questions could be asked of that brain. But there's examples as well where people advertise it falsely and say it can do amazing things. We're going to predict the way you vote. And a word of caution, they've even used it in legal cases in the US. But there's a wonderful book by a neuroscientist, Russ Poldrack. I'll just show you the book. I pulled it up. It's called The New Mind Readers. And it's quite an easy and fascinating read. Sorry, now, there it is. The New Mind Readers. And he goes through what we can and absolutely cannot reveal about our thoughts. So it's not that I could put someone in and then scan and then actually see what they're thinking, not a chance. From the anatomical regions active, I might be able to begin to think about which emotion they're experiencing. And if you trained it to know whether someone was going to choose right or left in a little task, eventually you'd get quite good at predicting which they were going to choose. So it certainly has a lot of limitations, but it's exciting all the same in terms of what you could design to be able to try to achieve with that.
Well, I'm just thinking that when I was doing research years ago on the whole area of stress, one of the things that is supposed to help us when we're experiencing stress is to talk about. And I've always put a question mark on talking is the best thing to do if we're feeling down or feeling depressed. I think it depends on the quality of the conversation. So from what you were saying there, that makes sense to me even in a different way. So if you're reading back somebody's story and they're hearing it and they're focusing on how difficult things are and how sad things are, and of course we need to do that as well. But if we're only doing that, then am I right in thinking that we keep trapping the difficult emotions? Whereas if we talk about what's happened in a different way, so acknowledging, look, this happened, it was very, very difficult, and this is how I overcame it, or this is what I've learned from it, and this is the resilience I've developed, then we're tapping into something else. Again, am I being too simplistic about it, or is that?
No, not at all. I suppose my example was just purely to be able to scan what does it look like when they're feeling that emotion. So it was on purpose nearly to read it back to them so that they could think it through and we look. But from sort of trying to be helpful and not just a neuroscientist researching something point of view, then I think I would point maybe to the biofeedback literature. So there's a small amount of really, I think, tantalizing literature about giving someone a visual, tangible feedback about their brain activation during some experience, such that they could moderate themselves the experience in relation to some stimulus or trigger.
Can you give an example, Dara, please?
So I think it's promising enough in case of phobias. I suppose a good example, this isn't an actual piece of research, but just as an example of what it could be, if you have quite a fear reaction to even just the image of a spider. If you could see this activation as a 4 or a 5 on a 5-point scale, showing you your amygdala activation, that's a brain center that reacts when we're anxious or afraid. And if you could see that you're reacting with a 4 or 5, but look at that image again and then regulate, then you've given someone something tangible where they in fact can see that they're letting themselves. Emotions are difficult, aren't they? They're quite intangible, and it's really difficult to put your finger and say, well, I'm feeling an 8 or a 7 or a 6. It's impossible, isn't it? So from moment to moment, getting better at recognizing your emotions and the levels, but perhaps some biofeedback interventions, maybe they will. So I think when you talk about talk therapy, you're absolutely right. If you're just talking, or it's that video about the nail in the head. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but there's a girl and there's a nail in the head and the boyfriend's on the couch and she's talking and he's, well, I think it's the nail in your head. No, stop. I just need you to listen. And eventually he learns and he's just listening and validating. And, and then she says, it's just a general pain here, and you're laughing, but actually the recognition, in oneself, it has to come from a place of awareness. We know this from teaching because there's something called metacognition, where if you teach even kids from early on to be aware of their own learning strategy, that's a whole new thing compared to them just sitting trying to learn on their own. Humans weren't always aware in the way that we are now about other people's thought. It's called theory of mind, but they weren't always. They think it began to evolve when humans started to wear jewelry, because that would have been the one, and there's little bits of evidence about that, where that would have been a point at which we began to think about what others were thinking about us. Yes. And to think about our own thoughts. So if you're just feeling, but you're not thinking about what you're feeling, then you're not engaging that metacognition. But if you're actually thinking about how you feel and you reflect on it, sometimes this is why writing it down is so helpful, and that you begin to become aware of what you're feeling, And there is a little bit of new work on neuroscience about metacognition coming out. There's another one I'm kind of excited about reading now. I'm going to show you it as well. It's by Steve Fleming, and it's called Know Thyself. And he's a neuroscientist, and he talks about the neuroscience of metacognition, or self-awareness is probably a simpler way to put it. And it's a very interesting read, and there's a lot of brain imaging being used in it as well. So although we maybe have a strong sense that that is effective in education, I don't personally think it's very strongly or widely applied in other fields just yet.
So Dara, translating that then into helping someone who's experiencing depression or bipolar disorder, does that link with what we call, or what the inner critic? So if we do something and then we think, you know, why did I do that? Or that was so stupid, or other people are judging me harshly. Those thoughts, that if we become aware of those thoughts as being unhelpful, that activity in itself can be very, very helpful.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I absolutely hate self-help books, mostly because I'm a scientist and there isn't enough evidence in them. But I am going to say that Flourishing, that one about like, you know, thriving in adversity, there's a lot of evidence in that. And the focus in there is some of the science and the neuroscience that's supporting some of the arguments in that are about the idea that we would pay attention 5 times more strongly to negative feedback than positive. That's hard to explain evolutionarily, perhaps because we need to focus on improving and adapting to survive and do better and get better feedback from the people around us. But if you know that, if you have knowledge of that information, then you can, I suppose, understand that you might need 5 positive comments in order to neutralize just 1 negative. It's like, I know all this, but I tell the kids the school report, and it's lovely, right? But there'll be like one poor little thing in there, one little like, oh, you could work a little harder on it. What does the kid go off with? They cry and they focus on that one thing. And it's dreadful, isn't it? Because but honey, look, like, they said this and they said this lovely thing and this positive thing. It is difficult, I think, for us to focus on positives.
Yes. Yeah.
But we can work to do some of that work. It's not simple or easy, and I'm certainly not saying it's all under our control. There are influences that are huge challenges, and some of the most adaptable and strong minds are those of people who have to work harder to do these things. Like when you have a disorder, like a depressive disorder, an anxiety disorder, you'll probably be, in fact, stronger at adapting and being aware than someone who never has to think about these things.
Could that explain then, Dara, why many people at the beginning of COVID last year were contacting me, for instance, but not just me, right across, who had experienced depression or anxiety a number of years, who were saying, actually, this isn't too bad. I'm able to cope with this. I'm finding it much easier than I thought it would be. Whereas people who hadn't experienced difficulties, we all do, but not major difficulties until then, found it really difficult. Would that be part of it?
I'm not sure. There's so many factors there. Personally, as a socially anxious person, it was wonderful. It just removed all of that exhaustion that you'd come home with from being like that. I don't know. I'm sure that varies a lot from person to person.
May I bring you back to the spider? Because in my work, if I'm working with someone who is experiencing anxiety around a spider, I use imagery a lot. So I might get them, so I liked how you're doing the scale, but I might also get them to think about, what to distract them. So what would the spider be like if it had loads of shoes? Would they wear scuffed runners? Would they have high heels? Would they have, and then they start to laugh, and then the association between the spider and is broken to a spider, and it could be something that I can have fun with. So is that something that taps into your work, and that you can have fun doing something like that, and actually imaging how that is then in the brain?
It's a difficult one to answer. I think, when we do memory tests, so cognition would be like your memory, or how to what extent you're able to pay attention to something, or executive control might be your ability to inhibit other things. So when we do those tests, some of them might check for associations. You might get these word pairs thrown at you: glass an elephant was one of the first ones anyone ever threw at me. And it was a series of words, and I was trying to pair them, and I saw this elephant on a big pane of glass. So it was really dramatic. And you couldn't forget that. And so they get to the end of the testing series, and then they're asking you some questions, and they go elephant, and it's like, yeah, glass.
Yes.
So I think we do learn as a paired association learning, like we do learn things, and we can. Mnemonics, students would use them all the time for complicated things. They have to learn the poor things. Like I'm one of those mean people, makes them learn all that, you know, they're 12 cranial nerves. What do they do? Where do they run? Where do they start? And they make these long mnemonics, wonderful ones. Sometimes you could never use them in a class, but they remember them.
Can you just explain what you mean by, I can't say the word mnemonics.
The mnemonic, where if you were trying to learn something that you might use the first letter of a series of complex words and put that together, string it together, and then make up something else that it stood for. Or like that, pairing the elephant with the glass, just creating a visual. Or the little tips and tricks for learning.
I can give you an example. I'm learning the guitar, and there's Eddie at Dynamite, Goodbye Eddie. So that's how I remember
BDF, yeah.
the chords. And the problem I've always had with those is trying to remember what I'm supposed to remember, and the sentence, and then once I get it,
yeah.
So,
and they do, so the longer ones are harder, aren't they? So they go into the exam, they scribble them in the corner, and then they get on with the test, and when they need it, they go back, because it's tough to remember these things. Like, yeah, I think normal spatial span is somewhere between sort of 7 and 8. So a sequence longer than that would be quite challenging to try to recall.
So with our brains, questions I have, and I'm going to just check, there's a few there, but in terms of how they work, how can we take care of them? The fear a lot of us have in terms of, as we get older, if we forget things, does that mean that we're going to have dementia? How can we guard against it? How can we protect it? And we got a specific question in, and I know you've explained you're a neuroscientist, so it's important for that person to talk to their clinician, and you could pronounce it and I couldn't. So in terms of memory, can you remember what that question was?
Was it
I have
a pituitary adenoma, was that it?
Yeah, that's it. Could a pituitary microadenoma affect emotional well-being? Now, I actually don't understand what that is, but I know you do.
So the pituitary gland is part of our hormone system, and emotions and the hormone system have a strong and tight link. So it's absolutely possible, and since a neurologist will be potentially treating the pituitary gland and an adenoma, and an oncologist or a neuro-oncologist, versus say the psychiatric symptoms might be addressed by psychiatrists. So I think the core thing would be to ensure that your neurologist is aware of those symptoms, or even your GP, whoever's coordinating, and then gets you in touch with the psychiatrist at the same time, so that you'll have help with both aspects. So sometimes it's about, I suppose, recognizing that there are two potential specialties needed there. Yeah.
You mentioned the amygdala. Do you have a slide of the brain structure that you could talk us through, please?
Yeah. That's my favorite question.
Good. And I'm just going to check while you're doing that. I'm just going to check. There's a few questions here in the question box.
Great. So this is a lovely app. So I'm rotating it there in front of you. So now we're looking straight at the front, where as if we were looking at the front of the face where the eyes are. And there's the side. And at the back, you can see underneath in purple, the cerebellum. And you can see in blue, the brainstem going down to the spinal cord. And I suppose in the occipital lobe, we would have our visual cortex for processing vision, even though the eyeball is on the very opposite side. Mathematical thinking, or looking up the meaning of a word, would be in the parietal lobe at the top in blue. And then the frontal lobe is, it initiates motor action or movement, but it'll also have a lot of what we talked about in terms of parts of the limbic system for emotion, production of speech, executive function, and some of those cognitive tasks. And then the temporal lobe is where we process hearing, at least initially. So just comprehending what someone's saying would begin at the top of the temporal lobe there in green. And the amygdala is in the temporal lobe. So if we kind of just spin this around, and I think the other side is going to go glass. Yep, there it is. And so as it goes glass, you're looking inside at different structures, and pop the, we won't label there. Okay, we'll pop to another.
And obviously that's not, our brains aren't those colors.
No, no, they're just the usual gross inside of the body color. We might skip that image. I'll show you an MRI in a minute now, and that might be nice to see. But here in blue is depicted the amygdala, and the hippocampus is in green. So a lot of where we begin to figure out where we are in space and memories would connect from the hippocampus to other regions of the brain from the green structure. And the amygdala is very close to the hippocampus. It's in blue there. For example, in a mouse, if you took those amygdala and damaged them, they'd be so docile and passive that if a cat came into the room, they wouldn't even get up and run. They wouldn't care. They could just be eaten. So they're really, we often think of anxiety as a negative, but it has to be remembered that some of it is an important function and part of bringing us to a point of readiness to engage in whatever it is we need to. Run away from something, take an exam, all of those kind of stressful things. And so there's a positive part to the function of the amygdala that I think is all too often forgotten. So in pink, that's the cingulate gyrus, and that's where some lesions are placed, for example, in deep brain stimulation, where an electrode would be placed to alleviate symptoms like obsessions and compulsions. So deep brain stimulation would literally go into that purple gyrus, the cingulate, place a little set of electrodes in there and then stimulate the region, and that would alleviate very severe oppressive obsessions and compulsions that are inhibiting the person. Now that's quite an invasive option, so usually there would be a requirement that pharmacological options have been really tried and tested a lot prior to a choice like that.
Is that the same thing as ECT, electric shock treatment?
No, so electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is, I think I stopped sharing there, yeah, but would be where electricity or is passed through the brain, and to the best of our understanding, it resets the functioning of those cortices. They're very active electrically, and if those patterns go astray, one hypothesis is that resetting that gives a person a chance. It has been demonstrated to be very effective at alleviating those symptoms, and because it's effective, it is still used, but it's not completely or thoroughly understood by any means at how exactly that helps us activate cortex in a more meaningful manner after the treatment. So deep brain stimulation is an invasive surgery, and during that neurosurgery, for example, they can test small pieces of cortex with little electrodes and check what can the person do during activation or deactivation of given areas to choose the precise piece of cortex that's correct to treat. Or they put a little electrode in that has four stimulators on it, and it allows them. The good thing about that is it's reversible, because you can turn it on or off. And how we know this works so well is it's come from neurology really first before psychiatry, where if it's placed in a region called the subthalamus, you see very dramatic videos that you can look up on YouTube of someone with Parkinson's disease who's had deep brain stimulation, or DBS, and can go from not being able to drink a glass of water at all to being able to lift it up and drink it when it's turned on, and then you turn it back off again and they lose that function again. So it's interrupting signals going from some A to some B, and that somehow disconnects then signals that we don't want, that are interfering with, for example, in Parkinson's, motion, or for example in OCD, the obsessions that are dramatically stopping that person from moving past them.
I know when we were talking about this, you were saying that there's so many new developments and it's really exciting, and there's so are you describing kind of innovations that are just happening? Like I'd imagine somebody must be at a very extreme level of, you know, very, very, very severe OCD for when nothing else has worked to even consider doing something like that. But is that something that could become a kind of a more mainstream approach in years to come, or?
Possibly. It, as you say, it's invasive, so you'd want, to have absolutely tried an adequate dose for an adequate duration of a certain number of pharmacological classes and various other things beyond pharmacological trials. You can see, I'll just diverge a tiny bit, in some of the brain imaging, you can see that talk therapy or psychotherapy will have an effect on the brain, and a pharmacological drug can have an effect on the brain, but nothing bet the two together.
Okay. No, you
And
said nothing beats the two together. Is that what you just said?
in a particular type of experiment, yeah. And you know, the way I think about that is that you can prime the chemistry to do something, but unless you're engaging with it, you're not giving it the chance to go ahead and have those dendrites search and find their connections for whatever that thought or feeling is, or disconnect as needs be. So, you know, if you take the medication and you rely just on it as opposed to having other supports at the same time, I think you're working a little bit against it rather than with it. Whereas if we take an example of postpartum depression, you bring the medication in and you have that eye contact. Well, now you really have that chance. You've given the chemistry a chance, and now you've given the human environment a chance for both to connect and for your system to adapt to maybe enjoying that stare or appreciating that stare with the baby in the way that you'd hope you would. But to go back to your question, the more exciting bit might be the less invasive things. So brain stimulation that's non-invasive, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or things that alter brain activation from outside the head without intruding. They're very new. They're not very specific in the region that they target. And the science is catching up now with saying, for a given disorder, these are the regions we should target. And so we need to get that technology from outside to be specific. Otherwise, we're not sure what it's going to do. And you need to be very sure. If you activate or deactivate a certain brain or set of brain regions that's a bit too broad, you're going to have more effects than you want. And that's just like some of our pharmaceutical drugs that do have side effects that are intolerable, where they do more than we want, but at least they do the bit we want. But we need to refine them to be more specific in their treatment. And so exactly how particular we can be about what we do with the external non-invasive stimulation techniques is something that at the conferences for human brain mapping, people would be quite excited about right now.
I remember when I was doing neuropsychology, what, 25, 30 years ago, it was at the level of if somebody had a stroke, you might cover one eye and show them a pen and ask them what it is. And they might say it's something you write with. And then you cover the other eye and ask them what it is, and they say it's a pen. And depending on the answer, that gives an idea in terms of what part of the brain has been damaged by the stroke. But my understanding then was that if that happened, well, really, there was nothing much that can be done. But I know from talking to you, again, a myth that might be that the brain cannot develop. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of confusion around that. And I think it's because, you know, you'll get messages like, well, we don't make new neurons in adulthood. Now, we don't, but we have a lot of tiny little baby ones left in there that are ready to activate and go and mature at different stages of life. So there's by no means some point at which it's too late and you're all downhill. And, you know, for certain receptor types, you know, they begin to decline at 40. For other certain cortical areas, they might change around, say, menopause or male menopause, like, you know, 55 or 65, you know, or up to 80. For myelin, we're born not with much at all, and it's our insulation to allow the transmission to be really efficient between different brain regions. And as we know, you know, they might be 23 or 25 before they make 100% sense in young adulthood. So some of that myelin, as it develops, that's a curve that looks a bit more like this up to 23 or 25. It's not, the brain isn't finished developing. And then we have curves that come with the experiences that we have in life, be they medical or social or traumas, various things that will impact us. And then we need to be robust to those as much as possible. So brain health, you know, as you know, independent of, you know, illness of any kind or mental challenges, brain health is something that, you know, we can all pay attention to, and it's an underlying thing. The evidence for how exercise aids in the brain and its robustness to challenge and its ability to heal and that's very robust data, that exercise, it increases blood flow and cardiovascular exercise. So we know that that's very protective and very, very good, and can delay different changes that happen over time. Sleep is another one where there's a lot of clear evidence that reasonable amount of sleep, not too much or too little, and finding your own set point for that is very protective. Julio Tononi is a neuroscientist who works a lot on sleep and really shows the protective effects of sleep. Alcohol, there's brand new data that really robustly shows that there's no level that's safe in tens of thousands, nearly 40,000 people from a UK cohort where they scanned 40,000 people. And even what we call in Ireland low levels of alcohol will thin the cortex. Where I think that's potentially relevant here is that it appears to affect cortical areas that are in the regions where we process emotion. And the trouble with that is that if you happen to have thinner cortex in some of those emotional regions because you have depression or bipolar disorder, then independent of the alcohol interacting with medication, you, even just in that situation, potentially are damaging cortex that's starting from a vulnerable point that maybe isn't just where it could be. And so I think there's the potential there for that to be just an added difficulty you don't need.
Dara, there's a few questions, and there's one specifically on sleep, but can I just read out a few? There's a question here. What are your thoughts on the role of mindfulness and meditation on physical changes in the brain from fMRI imaging? And maybe if I read three, so can you explain what happens to the brain if you oversleep or if you have insomnia? Does it affect a special part of the brain or does it affect the whole brain? And then why do we believe we only use 10% of our brains? And then our brains and neurons always grow and regenerate, am I right? So you've actually addressed that one. And then there's just a specific one, sorry, I said three, but a specific one on medication. Can Abilify trigger insomnia and intense high uncomfortable energy, physical agitation and obsessive thinking? Treatment for bipolar and EUPD feel way worse than this medication. That last one might be one where that's not your area of specialism.
No, and I don't know the side effects of Abilify, but I would point people to the core resources, right? So you don't want to sort of randomly search the internet for answers for things like that. So go to the HPRA, Health Regulation Authority, and look up that medication and then look for its side effects and check whether you have any that are listed. So go to the core resource for that. The other two resources I would mention would be clinicaltrials.gov is the US one, and the EU Clinical Trial Registry would be the EU counterpart, and those are approved trials. And if you want to put in a disorder name, you'll discover what's being tested and people are trying to discover about given either medications or treatments or interventions on those two sites as well. They can be really good resources. So I don't know really is the answer, as you suggested, Claire, for the specific side effects. I'll do a quick answer to the 10% brain energy bit. Do you know journalists, right?
You're great. There's going to be journalists listening.
Fabulous people. They'll, if you were to look at the brain, at just the glucose, you might say it uses 25% of all the glucose for your entire body. If you were to look at the energy or wattage of the neurons, you'd get a different answer, a bit higher. If you were to look at, so it depends on what you measure. And so when they come up with I'd call it an oversimplification, you have to be careful. We can always use any part of the brain that we activate and interact with. And I point out one really positive thing there. I hate to keep going with like flies and mice and this and that, but we know really concretely from rat experiments that if you put them in a novel environment, you will see growth and synaptic connections increase relative to one that they're really set with. So I would take that as a very positive. It definitely tells us about the adaptability of the brain, but that the novel environment can also stimulate and activate learning something new. We know that changes the brain as well. Like, so proactively learning something new or getting out into a new environment or novel social interactions, good ones. They will all generally be positive in terms of maybe optimizing the use or stimulation of the brain, I suppose. The insomnia question, I can't remember what exactly was the question. I scribbled down insomnia. So what the impact of that is.
What happens if it was kind of specific, what happens if you oversleep or if you have insomnia? Does it affect a specific part of the brain or the whole brain?
It is going to generically affect your ability to respond to anything, but that doesn't mean it affects the whole brain physically in a sort of an architectural sense. but it probably has impacts on the energy consumption, which you need time to recover from. There's something called default mode network, and it ties really into the next question with downtime for the brain. I won't really call it mindfulness because there isn't terribly strong evidence of a definite impact on the brain, not like psychotherapy, but then the number of studies are few and far between. Does it matter if we have evidence that if it helps you, if you feel better?
Yeah,
you know, that'd be the summary answer there. But the default mode, or the part of your brain that's the parts that are active when you're not doing something. So when you stare out the window and you come back and you don't realize you were staring at the window, but you do kind of realize you weren't actively thinking. Happens a lot when you're trying to study, right? You're paying attention to something and then you're glancing out the window and you're way off thinking about something. Oh shoot, I was supposed to be doing this. Those downtimes are critical. If you can't take those downtimes, if you're not able to for whatever reason, or you're pushing through, then you have a sort of a recovery that needs to happen, and your brain will default you into that if it needs to. And so they're anti-synchronous temporarily. In other words, when one is, if you're actively paying attention to something, that one's active and the default is not active. And then when you begin to daydream and you go off, this one becomes active and that one isn't. And that's absolutely natural, and it's good and it's healthy. And I'd say it's a natural part of learning as well, that the synapses connect. So the energy in your brain is a real thing. It's called ATP, and it can't go on forever. It needs its breaks, and it needs the larger break of sleep as well, so that the activations come down to a norm and then go back up again.
Dara, excuse me, the more you're talking, the more questions that are coming in. And I think this is going to be a real case of, that we're going to be left with lots of questions, and which I suppose is where you're at probably in neuroscience as a whole. But if I can read out a few more, there's just checking brain tumor diagnosis and how brain surgery may have long-term side effects. And this lady's appreciating that you're non-medical, but just it's a general query. And then going back to the pituitary Adama, is that how you say it? Adama?
Yeah, I think it was adenoma, but I didn't see it.
Adenoma. So the pituitary adenoma. Would you advise going to a psychologist? Well, not me, because I can't pronounce it, but I'm learning about it, I suppose. Would you advise going to a psychologist as well as an endocrinologist, Claire, as well as an endocrinologist, neurologist? Thank you. There's loads of big words in your area, in your field.
I think if the symptoms are interfering with your function, it's probably a psychiatrist that you want the referral to. And then depending on how bad they are, no matter what you're going through, any kind of other medical disorder, even the ones we don't connect to psychology, we know that the effects of dealing with anything like Parkinson's or post-surgery, any of those things, if you need to talk about them and to work out what you're thinking, then yeah, the clinical psychologist is a great idea if you can access it. A lot of people's workplaces now have the Employment Assistance Program, or EAP, and they can often access help that way as well, like just in terms of a resource. Does that answer it, I wonder?
Yeah, I think so. On the surgery then, the person going for brain surgery?
So they're very good now at making decisions about this. If it's aggressive, they're going to default to saving your life, and then what's gone is gone. And there could be functional impacts. If it's a slow burner, they can go in, take some, and Defoe is a Parisian neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon who really demonstrates this scientifically, where you can take some and do those electrical experiments during the surgery, and a neuropsychologist can be testing whether that person can, for example, still play the piano and move their fingers and recognize that a picture of a flower is a flower, and then wait a year for the cortex to reorganize itself and then go back in and complete the surgery. So that's only an option where this growth isn't going to take someone's life. But the work, for example, that the neuroscience that underpins that about cortical reorganization is really important. And it kind of goes back to one of your early comments, Claire, as well, about stroke. We know that if you're bilingual from the beginning, it's actually the same cortex you're using. So if a stroke impacts that cortex, then both languages may be lost in terms of speech production. But when we learn a second language later in life, or any other two things that are similar, you can lose the function of one of those pieces of cortex, but not necessarily the other. And ironically, sometimes that could be your native language and not lose the secondary language that you picked up. but it's quite unusual. And so the cortex can reorganize to move functions from place 1 to place 2. And it can move with and adapt much more than maybe we give it credit for.
Okay, Dara, the question, and my fault because I've asked you a few in a row, so apologies on that. But what are your thoughts on the role of mindfulness and meditation on physical changes in the brain from fMRI imaging? So the question has come back again.
I just say the jury's out. And the reason I say that is that the evidence at the minute doesn't allow me to say anything concrete, like there is an effect. But I suppose, I defaulted to saying if it's helping and it feels good, do it. But the reason that I'm saying the jury's out is because I don't think there's a strongly robust study with the sensitivity. What we have to remember as well is that we're not actually able to look at the level of neuron by neuron. So there are things we're not going to be able to see yet. And if we're blind to them, then we shouldn't say that they don't exist or they aren't happening. And so that's why I would just say that there isn't a strong effect, and I can't see strong evidence right now. But I guess that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist at some level that maybe we're not able to see right now.
Okay, Dara, there's about 5-6 questions, and I'm just going to read them, and
go for it.
Might be able to kind of come at them quickly. So I see there, I'm going backwards. Sacrocranial massage, any help? Can autism be seen on a scan? The name of the book you recommended is that Know Yourself and Know Thyself, The Science of Self-Awareness by Stephen M. Fleming. Really enjoyed the slides on the layout of the brain. Does ECT target the amygdala, or which part of the brain does it target, please? So maybe take those 4 and then I just go through the other 4.
Sure. So ECT doesn't target a particular area. It resets the activation across the whole cortex. Some bits of cortex do more to even out the activation across the brain. And so they may be more impacted by it, small areas like the claustrum, but so it doesn't target a specific area. It's quite general. Was there a question about the Fleming book, Know Thyself?
No, was that the book that you recommended?
Yes, yeah, Know Thyself, The New Science of Self-Awareness by Stephen Fleming. Yeah, nice and readable. Okay. Autism, does it show up on a scan? Absolutely. And we can see trajectories of development of white matter, and we can see some changes in those. There's a little bit of work about networks using diffusion MRI, and I'm happy to answer a question on Twitter if somebody wants to point it to research groups that work on that. I don't specifically, and that maybe have articles coming out about it. All massage is great, it feels good. I think throwing sacrocranial, in my opinion, in on top of it is probably salesmanship.
Dara, there's a question here that actually encapsulates a lot of the other questions. There's a question about childhood trauma, and there's one about disassociation, and somebody saying they really enjoyed the slides on the layout of the brain. Does ECT target the amygdala, or which part does it target, please? But this one I think is really probably, in the time we've left, has science got to the point where they can see the difficulties within the brain imaging where a client is struggling? So borderline PD, anxiety, OCD, depression, whatever. I'm just thinking frustration from people saying, Claire, you didn't ask my question. So I'm just going down through. And Dara, also my last question to you, but is what you would like us to take away from this conversation today?
Yeah, so at the minute, the brain imaging, sadly enough, and to my own despair, isn't concrete enough to help a psychiatrist make a decision about the diagnosis or treatment. So if a scan is asked for or a blood test is asked for, it's usually to rule something else out. And that's unfortunate. And that's where I think that's where the neuroscience is really pushing for, and where I think it'd be wonderful if we could cross that boundary and make it more biological. That's my answer really to about can we see the anxiety, not to the extent where it would influence the current management of the disorder from a clinical point of view. But the take home for me is that the brain is way more adaptable than we give it credit for. Exercise is powerful, sleep is powerful. I would say that there's the brain and there's the environment. By environment, I mean social context, the conversations you have, the tension in the home, as an example. You're learning something new and you're excited about it, as an example. Horse riding, whatever it is, this is your environment, this is your life, these are your decisions, and there's the brain. And it's no longer thought that, you know, it's static, there's something wrong with the brain and therefore it's going to affect all of this. And it's certainly not true. All of this impacts the brain and there's no role of the brain. You can do anything you want or think anything you want. You know, the old fashioned chin up matey kind of attitude. Neither of those are true. What's true is that we know that the brain influences your behavior and your reaction to these scenarios, and that these scenarios and your life decisions and environment impacts the brain. So I would say it's a two-way street, very definitely, from the evidence at the minute. And that's powerful, and that's something we can use to our advantage. And the adaptability of the brain is something that I think we, you know, can really use a lot and make the most of when we have feelings that are difficult or that interfere with functioning.
That's a really hopeful message, Dara. Like, it's great. So Sudoku and crosswords and all of that, we're not too young ever to start those, then I presume. Yeah.
No, but they get downright frustrating sometimes. Might be nice to pick up a book.
Yeah, and there was one of the comments there was from somebody talking about depression, referring to a philosopher, and apologies because the questions have gone off the screen. And also for any of people who are feeling frustrated, it's really kind of you to offer if people want to contact you directly. And Dara, just mille buekas, 1,000 thanks for your time, your interest. And I know you've given a lecture for Aware before, so just to let you know, you will be back, if that's okay. I'm fascinated by this, and I'm left myself with a lot more questions and answers, which is always really good for my brain, because it means it keeps waking up. So I'd like to give a sincere thank you to you, and then to let people know about next month. And we're into August, and Karen is going to put the slide up for who we have next month, which is building resilience in our children and young people. And we've chosen this for August deliberately because going back to school in the end of August, September can be challenging enough. But in the current context and climate we're in, there's a lot of concern about it. And also, actually, just to flag that, where we're going to have an extra webinar that we're going to pre-record on helping people go back into the workplace. And we're really excited by that. And that's in response to a lot of questions that we've received. But the August one, building resilience in our children and young people. And that's going to be with Dr. Barbara Dooley and with Dr. Coleman and, oh my goodness, Noctor. And Colin Noctor, and we're looking forward to it. And we encourage, as it says there, to go to Aware's website, and the previous webinars are there, lectures going back years, and all of the information on Aware's free support services. So that's it for this month, and just to thank you very much for your participation. And again, Dara, gur míle maith.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.